Classical architecture is still very present in our cities nowadays in the 21st century. We still see buildings, if you walk around the city of Madrid, that use pediments or columns with capitals that owe everything to the Greek and Roman architecture. So let's see first the characteristics of the Greek architecture. So one important thing that is related also with other aspects of the Greek culture is that Greek architecture always tried to maintain the human proportion compared to the architecture, for example, of the Egyptian period of the Mesopotamians that tended to be huge, monumental. Greek architecture always took into account the proportion related with humans. Greeks did not use arches and vaults, so their architecture was always using architraves, which means that they use columns or walls with roofs that made a 90-degree angle. Yeah, and in general they were obsessed with harmony between the proportions. Yeah, and they made a strong identification between this and their concept of beauty that existed in the different arts, from architecture, sculpture, painting, music. That concept of the relation between beauty and proportion and balance was very present in their lives. So, as I was saying before, we see that the Greek architecture is like the Greek styles in architecture are still in use in our day. So they invented the 3 architectural orders. The simplest was the Doric order. The column was thicker and it didn't have any base. And it was like a robust column with a simple capital. Then we have the second type of order, that is the Ionic, in Español jónico, and the columns were more slender, thinner, and the capital was decorated with 2 vaults. And then we have the Corinthian order, the last of the 3, that had also more slender columns, also with base as the Ionic, and the capitals were decorated with acanthus leaves. The acanthus is a plant that we can still use a lot in gardens, and it has huge leaves. Yes, a very leafy plant. So these, like the typical Greek buildings, use one of these 3 orders. So the Doric is the oldest one, and the Corinthian is the less, the most modern. But I mean, they were invented in a very short period of time. And usually, at the front of the building, they had, the building will have like a 2-sided roof, and then this will create a triangle. This triangle is called pediment, in Español el frontón, and it was a very important part of the facade in a Greek building, and it was used to include there some reliefs, so some sculptures as decoration. Usually Greek buildings also were elevated, so had a platform with stairs. So obviously, when I'm describing all this, you are thinking on a temple, because the Greek temple is the most iconic building for the Greeks. So there were a variety of temples depending on if they had columns just in the front and in the back, all around, or 2 lines of columns. As we mentioned in the previous part of the unit, Greek temples were very strict. I mean, only the priests could enter in the temple. So they were more designed to be seen from the outside. So apart from the decoration of the sculptures in the 2 pediments, there were usually a series of decorations in squares that were called metopes, that were all around the frieze, el friso, so like a band that went all around the perimeter of the building. Nowadays, if we go to Greece or to other parts where we have Greek temples, we see them all white in marble or other rocks. But at that time, they painted their buildings in bright colors. Yeah, so the look that they had to be very different to the look that we have nowadays. The second type of building that was more common and has survived until our days is the theater. Greeks invented theater as we understand it, and they built many theaters nearby the cities. So they used the natural slope of the mountain, la colina natural, and they built there the stairs where people could sit. They created more or less half circle, concave space that was called the cavea. In Spanish, it's also we use also that name. Yes, so it's where all the public was seated, and then that allowed them to create a very good acoustic. So people without microphones, obviously, could project their voice, and like people from far distant places could hear them. So at the center in the scenario was the scena and the orchestra, that had a circular shape, and is where the performance took place. So Romans, like in many other aspects, learned from the Greeks, but also added a lot more to their architectural capacities. In general, we have already said that Romans tended to be more practical and less idealistic than Greeks, and that also and very clearly applies to their type of architecture. So although they took many of the elements and, for example, the architectural orders of the Greeks, they developed a way bigger variety of capacities or styles or models of construction, materials, techniques, and so on, as we are going to see now. So, for example, in the aspect of religious buildings, of temples, they tended to copy the Greek ones. They maintained the use of the three orders, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian, although they added one more. That is what they call the composite order. That was a mix of Ionic and Corinthian in the capital. Yes, so it was a mix of the two capitals. But they were more flexible using these systems, and they included some small changes. But they went way beyond. And we said that one of the characteristics of Greek architecture was that they use architraves. Yes, so they only use an architecture that was designed in straight angles. But Romans learned from the territories that they had occupied the advantages of using arches and vaults, arcos y bóvedas. So building with arches and vaults gives you way more opportunities of building. You can build taller buildings and with different shapes. You can use other materials. Yes, so their architecture was going to be way more versatile. So Greeks mainly used stone. If possible, they used marble. But Romans, although they continued using stones, and actually they loved colored stones, like different types of granite of colors, or like also colored marbles. But they realized that building just in stone was very expensive and difficult sometimes. So they incorporated the use of bricks from Mesopotamia, and they even adobe, and then they cover it with better materials. Yeah, so in the inside they built with cheaper materials, and then in the outside they made it nice. They invented what they call the opus cementum, so we can say more or less that is cemento, that was very easy to make, very cheap, very resistant, and you can make it almost anywhere. This was going to be very important to understand the proliferation of Roman buildings and infrastructures. But not only it was with materials, but also with the tools that they developed, that they invented a whole series of machines that will help them to transport and lift and move heavy materials, okay, and we will allow to build those huge buildings that otherwise would have been impossible. So they inherited the tradition of the Greeks of public buildings, but they expanded it a lot more. So in the field of like practical engineering, they invented, we can say, like stone bridges that until then had not existed in Europe, and also aqueducts systems, not only like the aqueduct in Segovia that I'm sure you know, but in general the whole system that brought water from sometimes tens of kilometers away from the city into a city, that required very complex calculations of inclination or tilt, so the water got from the source to the city. So this had like an incredible level of complexity that Roman engineers managed to achieve in order to do this. And also the roads are very famous. Yes, so the Roman Empire developed a very complex network of roads that were designed, very well designed, okay, just to, they didn't have many curves or many changes of level, and were adapted to be used by carts and to transport the troops and their goods from one place to another of the empire. Roman roads were so good that they continued being used for more than 1,000 and almost 1,500 years after they were built. So we can imagine, like Europe continued using these roads for a very long time. And then we have the more like entertaining or leisure buildings. So they took the idea of the Greeks of the theater, but they developed it in a way that didn't need the slope of the mountain as they had used before. The Greeks had been using, so they created buildings completely built using different stages or levels with galleries covered with vaults and arches, and they made theaters that were half a circle for theater plays, and then they made amphitheaters that had more like an oval or elliptical shape that were used for other type of shows such as gladiator fights or naumachias. And then they also had the circuses that were not like our circuses, that were created to have chariot races, carreras de caballos, that were super popular in Rome. They could bet, no podían apostar, and they were super popular amongst the Romans. So in most of the major Roman cities we can find a circus, a theater, and an amphitheater. If you go to in Spain, if you go to Mérida, or if you go to Tarragona, or to many other Roman cities, you will see all these buildings. Apart from that, another very common public building that the Romans always had were the thermae, the baths, public baths, okay, that were more than a place to get clean. They were a place to meet. They had 3 different types of pools at different temperatures, but they also had a gymnasium to practice sport, and also usually a library and other public spaces where people could meet. So it was a place like going to a cafe. It was a place to meet people. So we could continue for ages talking about the legacy in architecture of the Greeks and Romans, because if we look around, as I said at the beginning of this video, many of the things that they learn are continuing use, and in the Western culture, they are still the foundation of all the architectures that we have.